As part of LICAF Live, this is Infinity and Beyond, in association with SouthernGFX, who's me, a special section of the Comic Festival devoted to how technology is pushing the boundaries of comics. So our first interview for LICAF is with Raitt, and this man for me is one of the most influential people in the industry. So Raitt has worked across so many different sectors and companies and departments. It just blows my mind. So he worked on with Steve Oliff on Ollie Optics on the very early Image comics, so things like The Pit, Max, Spawn, some Batman Spawn. He did obviously he was part of the colour separation team in those early days on those McFarlane titles. He was part of the massively influential on the facial rig for Gollum, Wetta Studios. And he then worked for Valve, and then broke away from that kind of world after a good few years, and just went travelling, and now works on his own IP with his own VR comic, Nanite Fulcrum, and one or two other projects that he might be able to tell us about. So let's interview Raitt. So good evening, good morning, whichever it is. Obviously for you, it's 11 o'clock at night. For me, it's 7 in the morning. So what we wanted to do today, and you obviously being involved in this kind of industry so much, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the comic industry for the LICAF Festival. So as you know, we've talked about this through the year, and the LICAF Festival it's one of the big festivals in the UK that brings together comic artists. So it's very much not a Comic-Con. It's very much about the people that are creating the art. And obviously you being an artist and being involved in this kind of the periphery of the comic industry and the comic industry when you started, I wanted to talk to you as the first speaker or first guest on this little exercise. So yeah. I'm going to ask you a set of questions. There's no format to it. It's very relaxed. So first of all, can you just tell us who you are? That would be amazing.
Sure. Yeah. Hey everybody. My name is Raitt, and I'm a bit of an odd guy. I learned how to do as many things as I possibly can. So I'm a modeler and a sculptor and a concept artist, but I'm also a film editor and a tool designer and an animator and a rigger. I know how to write code. I'm the left brain, right brain kind of guy. I like to joke that I have the dream job of every 14-year-old because when I was a teenager, I got to start out working for a guy named Steve Oliff at Ollie Optics on the first Image comic books. And so The Pit, the Max, Spawn, Akira, some Batman stuff. And that was like my first job, was coloring comic books. And then I worked most notably on The Lord of the Rings. I was responsible for building Gollum's facial animation system. And I worked in the Cave Troll and the crowd systems and the Balrog. And then I also worked at the Wetta workshop as a concept artist and sculptor with Sir Richard Taylor and Jamie Biswarek and all those fantastic designers and artists over there. And then I also worked for 9 years at Valve. I was a Valve employee, and I worked on mainly on Team Fortress and on the Meet the Team shorts, but I also worked on a little bit on Left 4 Dead, Left 4 Dead 2, Portal, Day of Defeat Source, Half-Life, Episode 1, Episode 2, a whole bunch of stuff, shipped a lot of games. And yeah, I'm kind of like, leave me alone in a computer, and that's my happy spot.
You are exactly the right person for this segment of the event, because the fact that you started and you've just named things like the McFarlane stuff and Spawn, and you were in the early days of when computers were even, well, we weren't obviously, computers have been around for a lot longer than we have, but in terms of using it with comic art, that early days of inking and and coloring specifically, I think that I guess that's some of what you would have been doing back in those early days. So
yeah, I mean, it's pretty cool. My heart's always been in comics. I mean, after I parted ways with Valve, my wife and I drove around the country for a number of years in an Airstream, and I was like, what do I really want to do with the time that I have left? And I was like, I really liked my time in comics, like, because in comics you can speak with one voice. You don't necessarily have to water it down. It's a personal expression of whatever you think is cool. And you can be the casting director and the production designer and the animator and the director and the editor, and you can tell the stories. And you plop a word balloon on anything and suddenly it takes on extra meaning. And like when I was at Valve, I did these Team Fortress comics with Mike Oeming, and he was like a hero of mine. He'd done Powers, and he works on Thor, Ragnarok, and He's doing the After Realm comic right now, and he's just a brilliant guy, and his ability to just crank out comics is staggering. Like he's got more trade paperbacks than anybody, and he and I are really good friends, and we worked on the first Team Fortress comics, and we didn't have a colorist, and I was like, you know what, I actually have this skill. I'll color the first set of comics. And so I went through and did all the color separations in Photoshop and just just went into beast mode. And I was like, I really like that directness, because it's like from your pen and then a little bit of time later, and then there's the audience has it, right? And that's awesome. So when I was driving around the country, my wife was like, well, what do you want to do? Like, what do you think is cool to do? And I was, 3D comics don't exist. And I'm like, I'm a sculptor, right? So like I make, here's a 3D print of a thing that was like a self-portrait of me, but this is actually printed in metal.
Wow.
That a buddy of mine did. And like, these are like things from my comic. So basically I started I was like, I want to make 3D comics so that they're real, like not JPEGs.
Yeah, so
actual like things you can spin around.
It's leaping from the paper into the computer and back out again, which is a bit ironic, isn't it? So
yeah, right.
Yeah, that's crazy.
I remember like as a kid, I was I don't know if have you ever read this? The Perfect Collection?
Absolutely, yeah.
Miyazaki. And the thing for me was like as a kid, I was totally just like I was blown away by how he's able to make Lord of the Rings density of material, and this was before Studio Ghibli was formed. And when I read these books, I was always just blown away by like, oh, he's got like a background artist and an effects guy and a person, and he's treating it like animation production, but he took it seriously. And I was just kind of thinking like, I really want to make a lot of stories, and I think storyboards and screenplays are cool, but they're kind of executive focused. They're not really for the public, they're not for fans, for me basically. And I was like, making comics, like you can read a comic book and have a really good experience. You do the work in your imagination and it fires you up. And I don't know about you, but like I get super inspired by like the scurry comic and the stuff that people do, or you're just like, oh, this is making me want to take my pen out and do some artwork. And
I mean, you've just described my life really. So
yeah, right.
That and that you just said then about story and characters. A lot of the things that inspire me are just the audible stuff. So I just listen and then I see it and then I create it. So, and I know you're the same as that. I can, because we've known each other from a distance for quite a while, and I can see how your brain. A lot of people that do what we do get that way, don't they? I guess you don't watch that much media. I bet you just keep making it, which is the normal thing that I hear.
I weight book. So I do a lot of stuff where like there's a progress bar going across the bottom of the screen, and that drives me insane. So I alt tab over to a window and I like to trawl through the internet for information. I can't watch television very much. Like I can have it on in the background, but I just can't. Yeah, I like to just sift from too many different sources, but
I watch telly when I draw. If I watch telly and I'm not drawing on the iPad or a Wacom, then I fall asleep. So I don't do the traditional couch kind of life, even though I'm built like a couch potato, but maybe I'm a couch melon. We can talk about that melon.
Oh yeah, melon here. That's a good segue here. I'll turn on my melon.
Switch over to melon, yeah. So I've got some a little list of questions that I want to go through. So we've covered some of the career history, which I have to be honest, that is just listening about your career history always inspires me. You're one of the first modelers that got me to do what I do now. Really, I watched you in the 90s, and knowing that you were going into Lord of the Rings, it just blew me away. But what I'd like to know is, you've just talked about one of your comic heroes, one of the comics that have influenced you, but can you just pick a couple from your childhood and your teens, the comics and the characters and the storylines? So let's say one character and one epic storyline that have influenced you.
Oh man, that's an awesome idea. Well, so here's my watermelon. Do you want me to answer as watermelon or as me? I just turned it on, but I can turn it off.
No, I'd leave it on for this segment because I think it looks cool. So visually appealing.
Yeah. Well, so the thing that I really like is character. Oh, there's so many good characters. You ever read the Rocco Vargas comic?
Remind me.
He's a Spanish artist, and Daniel Torres he does this story about like kind of like he's kind of like a James Bond kind of figure, but he lives in like a future where the solar system has civilizations on every planet and every rock and every asteroid, and he runs a club called the Mongo with like a pool on the roof and like robot waiters. And the fantasy world of Rocco Vargas's life, like he's got like a rocket ship in his basement and like beautiful women are trying to get him to go to Neptune to steal stuff, and he's just like this larger than life, broad-shouldered like superhero guy. But the world that he lives in and the life that he has, like the Mongo Club, it's like that fantasy of like, even as a teenager, I was like, man, if I could own a club with a pool on the roof and a rocket ship in the basement and have robots as best friends, and like, like it just is glamorous, larger than life. And the thing is cool about it's super optimistic, because it's like he's got, and it's totally like Flash Gordon style, like the aesthetics are like, if you look at the illustration, or if you look it up afterwards on Lembiek, like there's something about it where it just makes me happy as like an escapist. I love the escapism of this stuff, like the whole popcorn on cheese. I'm like, yeah, the life is serious, but I like, ooh, like the awesomeness of that kind of like, no. Like I like that stuff. It just cracks me up. So like I totally think like Rocco Vargas is awesome. Story you said was the second one?
Yeah, so it was really your favorite character. So that'll do for your character. So let's talk about, is there a long, so whether it be Marvel or whether it be any of the indie stuff, is there a storyline that you've kind of loved? Like I remember like I followed the very, very, from Spawn 1, I followed the first sort of like 100 Spawns.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Work on Spawn 18.
I just, because I was never a Marvel guy. I never liked that world. I was a 2000 AD, and the only American stuff I touched was after he went from Spider-Man and went over and did his own stuff. I just loved what he did with Spawn, the anger in it, and that early part. I don't follow it now. Yeah. But is there anything like that you can remember from the 80s and the 90s? Any story arc that went on for a while, or any
I was really lucky, because when I was working at Early Optics, we were on the Marvel pull list and the DC pull list and the Dark Horse pull list, which meant that these like basically a meter of comics would show up every week. Wow. And they had like a building just dedicated to storing comics, and so it was like comics piled floor to ceiling like a warren, like a labyrinth. And like you could wander through there. And so when we weren't coloring, and then we only had a fixed number of computers to do the coloring, and so everybody worked in shifts to color the comics as fast as possible. And this was in the beginning of computers, like the very first computer colors, right? Like this is before Photoshop. We had to like type in the CMYK numbers. And Steve Oliff was awesome as a crazy lunatic boss. And he and Todd went back and forth, and then Todd's like originals would show up, or Dale Keown or the other folks' original comic art would show up, and then we'd scan them and color them as fast as possible. But we only had so many computers, so people had to like have a lot of downtime. So we read comics. Yeah. And so talk about like 80s and 90s. I had access to everything. And I was a teenager and I was a comic book nerd. So I read like everything. Yeah. So like, it's like like in my mind, I'm like, there was a time when I read every comic that existed. Yeah. Totally. Like, and so like, I think about like, I got really allergic to the Cape comics, honestly. Like I love things like Powers, like Oming and Bendis's Powers, the first ones especially. And I loved watching Dave Sims's weird biography as Cerebus. Yeah. And I loved seeing like Sergei Aragonés like Gru comics and like his abilities to draw so fast at Comic Cons. And I mentioned to me
he obviously does he was at the last event giving away his or was it the last before one? Because he does the award, and just to see him sketching, but he was there with his pen and pencil between two guys on Wacoms, and it was.
He's a beast, man. Like,
oh yeah, he's just such an influence in the industry, in the world.
And he owns. I mean, watching him do Pictionary is like, as an artist, it's like the artist Olympian, where you're just like, you can draw that fast. Holy crap!
It's mad, isn't it? The storytelling in that guy, two or three lines from him, and that's a little novel, isn't it? So.
Yeah, it's incredible. He does a lot of. He's really good at that Eisner kind of like making multiple moments happen simultaneously in a panel, because people get confused sometimes from coming from film, where they're like, "Oh, it's a storyboard." And you're like, "No, comic books like." all time can exist in one panel. Like you can have like 75 events in one panel. That's not a sequence to sequence thing. It's all about weaving this cool context. And I don't know, like Jeff Smith, there's some moments in the, you ever read the Jeff Smith, the Bone series?
Yeah, I've got them literally in front of me.
Did you read the second one, the watercolor ones that him and Vice did?
Yeah.
And there's like the river dragon. I think that the river dragon with the two dogs.
Yeah.
That little like postscript story was just like, I thought about it's called Rose, I think is it's called.
I can't remember. I've not gone back to it for it's funny because I was looking through the comic collection before we started this interview today, and Bone is one of the. Bone reminds me of. Do you ever read any of the Anne McCaffrey Dragon books and all of that world?
Yeah.
She's never gone beyond the book. Luckily, she's never let anyone take it and make film or anything from it. But that world is one of the worlds that's kind of like you can go anytime you want and just dive into it. And that's my favorite kind of dragon world, which is sci-fi. But then Bone is one of them where you literally go to that place, and he does the journey that he does. And when he travels across a land, you actually in just black and white line, let alone the ink, the color. I just feel like his ability to say it, and his style changes because obviously Bone's one look, and then the girl characters come in, and he rolls in different styles with it within the same page. It's crazy.
Well, it's storytelling, right? Like he accumulates that story. Like by the time you get to the end of Bone, and you compare it to where you were at the beginning with the snow jokes and the stupid rat creatures, is amazing. And when you read the Rose comic, and the dogs basically sacrifice themselves. I don't know, spoiler.
Spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert. But there's a moment in there where it kind of gets you. Sorry, my phone is ringing.
We're in COVID time, so
we are.
Interruptions are expected. Not even. We want to see the interruptions.
But yeah, no, it's a thanks for that. I'll make sure I just texted, make sure they'll call me back. But yeah, I there's so many. Do you ever read the Herman Gun in the Water series?
No, I know the one you mean, but it's not on my list. So it's not on my shelf.
They're a little bit like a kind of a dark Mad Max kind of story, but there's an atmosphere that they managed to capture in there that is just like, I'm just in awe of it.
Yeah.
I'm
gonna reference some of these in the.
That's the thing about comics though, is that like, it's like your favorite movie, right? Like there's so many different genres. Like there's funny ones and horror ones and adventure ones and inspiring ones. And like, I don't know, I'm always kind of like, when I go to the comic book store, I always look for the thing that's not just another teen angst story, but something that's got something where the person's got something to say, and like when you have a person who's like, I've got something to say and I've got like a creative sensibility and a visual style that is serving that story, that's what I love the most about comics. And so like I just read the Loisel Peter Pan.
Oh wow.
And that book is just
crazy.
It's like it's kind of like reading The Wind in the Willows watercolors, where you just look at every panel and you're like, this is awesome. And then you look at
read it, because you
like you read like 4 or 5 pages a day, and you're like, man, that's really inspiring. And the thing that's cool is that like there's a lot of like blood, guts, semen, sweat, tears, chaos in there that would never make it past a censor for a big expensive production. And that's where like you feel like the heartbeat of the creator on the other side of the page. Two of you are in collaboration making this moment, and you're like, this is really personal. This is intimate in a way.
That's the golden ticket, isn't it? That's what we miss sometimes, I think these days.
Yeah. And that was kind of why I want to try and figure out a way to, like, because I do all this 3D stuff with like the silly watermelon. Maybe I'll take the watermelon off. But like,
well, I quite like it, but if you want to take
I'll leave it on. That's fine. I don't mind.
If you're getting hot in there, then I don't mind.
No, it's totally fine. It's easy to wear. It's like the funny thing about the watermelon, I have a joke, which is that when I first made him, I was like, I'm naked.
That's ridiculous.
Little nod to Steve Oderkirk and his thumb wars. Because it's totally thumb wars, but it's like a live webcam version.
That's crazy. I'm going to move on to. So sorry to cut.
Yeah.
I'm going to the next thing. I mean, that's I could literally talk about that stuff with you all day long. You're quite passionate about using VR creation tools, and obviously we both are. We've been doing it for 5 or 6 years, and you a lot longer,
Yep.
because of your work with Valve, I assume. But what I wanted to know a little bit about is one, how you first experienced VR creation tools, and then move that into, then we'll start talking about your 3D comic, because the big thing about what this chat is about for me is the 3D comic element of what you do. So first of all, let's just quickly cover off VR, which for anyone that doesn't know is virtual reality. And when I say creation tools, that means we now can create our stuff in VR. So let's just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So yeah, basically I started building VR, and I knew about it because I was at Valve, so I knew that we were building it, and I'd seen it for a long time, so I was one of the early people. And I actually worked on the VR 1.0 stuff back in the 90s. Like there's a Silicon Graphics, like the WRL format, the first WRL formats. Like I helped write them by hand. Like I made the characters for them. So like I'd known about VR for a long time.
Yeah.
And I wasn't quite sure that it was going to take off, and I wasn't quite sure if I was really interested in it. And then Brian Sharp from Oculus Medium and Jason Holtman, who was running the store, who I'd worked with at Valve, was like, hey, you have to check out Medium and just go get in this booth and make a thing with Brian. And so I basically put on the headset this is before the touch controllers came out.
Yeah.
And I basically used Medium in like an alpha version or whatever. Right. And I remember just sitting there going like, this is incredible. Like the fact that I could take and hold my models with both hands and resize it. And I don't know about you, but like before computers, you had to go to the copy center and like make an enlargement of your drawing or shrink it down. And so you would like draw something really big and then go to a copier and shrink it, and it would make all your details smaller than you could actually draw with your fingers.
Yeah.
And like I had that same moment in Medium where I was like, I could sculpt something really big, do all the details of like a tear duct, and then shrink it back down and have this little model that had these incredible details that I could look at. And I was like, that is awesome. And because it's in stereo, it's not just in 3D where you're spinning around, but it's in stereo 3D. So you're looking at the thing right in front of you, and you can get vertigo if you're looking off a thing, and you could look up at it. And I was just like, this is awesome. And I remember at the same time, I was doing a lot of work with voxels with 3D Coat. And I was just like, I'd done a lot of stuff with edge loops. I mean, you and I know we go back in the edge loop world, right? And sort of box modeling and all that stuff with Mirai and Nendo and Wings. And I was like seeing that I could work without wireframes, like this wireframeless workflow. And I was building stuff in 3D Coat where I was like, I'm in voxels, I hit a button, I can generate a 15,000 poly mesh with good UVs and good textures, and everything's baked. And I've never once looked at the textures or looked at the wireframes.
Yeah.
I am so much faster.
Yeah.
And so I was basically, the combination of 3D Coat and Oculus Medium basically inspired me to start up my 3D comic company, because I was like, I can work as fast as I do in comics now.
Yeah.
Because that's the thing about Jeff Smith and Oming and the rest and regular comic book guys is, they crank out 22 pages of comic art in 22 days. And that's a day of stuff. And that's like 9 panels a day, like that's a lot of pixels to crank through. Right. Especially for American comics, which are not made as slowly as European comics, and manga is even faster than that. Yeah. And so I was just like, it's gotta be fast. It's gotta be crazy fast. And once I saw that, like, I could work in VR and work in voxels and in Medium and in other tools, and I could like hit a button and procedurally make it into a thing that I could then send to an audience.
Yeah. I
was like, this is a new door, because normally it's like being at Wetta, where you've got thousands of people and there's a certain productivity rate that's just too fancy. It's too every shot's a money shot. You can't possibly feed the appetite of an audience following a serial story. Yeah. And that's really what I've been doing, is like, because the first comic that I made was in VR, and you could like stick your face into the panels, and it was like a book of portals, and it's on the Oculus Rift store.
That's Nanite Fulcrum, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, Nanite Fulcrum, and it's kind of issue 0 or issue 1. It was a bit of a prologue. I basically have a longer story that I'm working on, and I took one of the scenes that happens earlier, and I told it as a story just to see if it's kind of like a prototype, right?
Now, so if anyone's watching now, you can while Bay's talking now, I'll show some of that. I'll record some of me.
Yeah, it's and that for me, it was like, it's a magic book that you'd want to read at, Hogwarts, right? Like the panels move as you look at them. They're sort of like little windows into a new world that have animations. And I basically hid bonuses inside these bonus panels. So there's like collectibles, there's achievements, there's little mini games. And as a creator, it's like you make all these little experiments making games and making movies that never see the light of day because they're too small for the general public to want to consume. And then I realized like, ooh, I could take all those weird little game prototypes and those weird little concept art pieces and those weird little sculptures that I do, and I could just jam them into the corners inside bonus panels inside of a 3D comic. And I could make like a little treasure hunt in the comic. And I was like, yeah, comics should totally have achievements and mini games and toys in them. Like, yeah, why not?
I remember all the goodies. Obviously, I bought it the minute you released it, and you know the fact that you've got your comic in front of you and you can put your head in it and get little goodies is just. It's just getting your freebies off the front of the magazine early, isn't it?
Yeah. It's like the magic toy in the cereal box, right? Like when we were kids.
Yeah.
And I was just like, that's all comics should do this. And I was like looking at like, you know, the digital comics that you see online and the web comics and like Comixology stuff. And I'm just like, these are just JPEGs from the 90s. Like, where's the 3D-ness? Where's the watermelon pants version of this? Yeah. And I was just like, yeah, I want to bring that feeling that I have with regular comics into 3D, because I love 3D art. I love Sketchfab. I love looking at ArtStation. I love looking at ZBrush Central. I love, you know, I love your work. We're all part of these different communities stuff. And to me, it's like, we're the logical extension of where comics were and graphic novels when we were kids.
Yeah.
And now with like Diamond shutting down and DC going through its problems and the COVID times, you're like, the comics world is faltering. And at the same time,
it's evolving well, I wouldn't even say it's because I don't think it knows what's happening at the minute. And a lot of people watching this will have an opinion on that. And if you search online, and obviously with the thing that we're doing here, talking about the future of comics, you get a lot of conversations about people just thinking that a comic will just get scanned in and put on some kind of portal and that's it. And that's going to happen. That's already happening, and that leads to the piracy. That leads to all of the other issues. But the evolution will never be what people just, you know, it's never just going to be what we had ported onto another platform. That's just in history. I think that doesn't happen, does it?
Yeah, like porting legacy content is just like a way to make pirates happy. Because one of the things I learned working in games was that like you got to think of it like it's a living thing that has a heartbeat. And you give it an updates on a regular basis, and you got to be prepared for that. And that's how you defeat a pirate by out selling them, outworking them, right? Because pirates only just want
easier to take it legally than to take it illegally is the method, isn't it?
And the thing they're never going to do is they're never going to create new content, whereas you can create new content. And so if you just release it like, you know, a chunk at a time, like you ask about a story. Have you seen the Wormworld saga stuff?
Yeah.
Like that comic is inspiring. Like to me, like the fact that he's got the scroll so he can always just append new pages. He doesn't have to worry about page formatting, and it just updates on a regular basis. And he's just like a ticker tape. And you could steal that content, but it's so much easier to just go to the website and read the real thing. And at the end,
and hopefully give the money to the creator at the point of contact, which is the thing that's going to get harder for people, isn't it? So
yeah, and that's the thing I like about like the way that he's doing his stuff is that he's right at the end when you're happiest about the comic, he says, "Hey, do you want to buy a poster? Do you want to buy a book?" And it's money that goes directly to him.
Yeah.
And to me, that's just like, I'm just like, this feels like the future of this kind of work.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know, here, I'll turn off my water. I keep getting distracted because I'm staring at my watermelon.
I like the water.
All right, I'll leave it on.
No, turn him off for a bit, because people might be getting disturbed if they've just like jibbed in and just
they're like, what is he doing?
Yeah, why is this guy wearing a watermelon? Or is he a watermelon? Yeah.
Yeah, well, the thing I was going to show you though was like in the background here, like the Scurry comic. I don't know if you've checked out the Scurry books, but like I just ordered that from the creator, and you know, he signed the bottom of it, and he sent me this awesome print, and I look at it and I'm just like, you know, he's a VFX concept artist who works in movies, and he knew that there was no path for him to tell his stories on the movie channel, and so he flipped over and he basically made like a web comic that comes out, and he basically has like these really successful Kickstarter campaigns, and he hypes posters and books, and I'm just like,
maybe we should give him a call, actually. He would be a great example to follow on from this chat. You know, if some of the, obviously we've got a list of people we want to talk to, Brian Sharp being one of them from Oculus.
Yeah.
and Brian's moved on, and Brian's drawing some comic work now, which is
it's cool to see him sculpting and drawing now.
Yeah, it's great. So we'll see if we can get hold of these guys, and that'd be a great one to follow it up with.
Yeah.
Do you, on that conversation, and we don't have a lot of time left, unfortunately, but in terms of the evolution of comics, what do you feel about the next? Let's call it the next 10 years. What can you see any key changes? We've just discussed some of them, but what would you think is going to be a big turn in the industry, or do you think anything will break the industry? I mean, if anything was going to do it, it would be COVID. But what do you think? 10 years.
I think the comic book industry is really a talent pool and a talent market for these other industries that have been used to making so much money, like namely movies and games. And you have like people who work in gaming and work in VFX who are comic book artists, and they basically get paid a lot more money to stop being comic book artists to work on these other things.
The person we're interviewing next is exactly a 2000 AD artist, started in Bizarre Creations on Activision games. So what you see, we've got live examples of what you're saying there.
And I think that I don't think that's a bad thing. I mean, I love games and I love movies, and I think there's room for all three of them. I think games, movies, and comics are the trifecta of pop culture, and I think comics are their own little place because they're an experimental place and a personal place. It allows creators to do more ambitious things that they can't do in a game and they can't do in a movie, because in a game and a movie you need these giant crews, you need this huge amount of money, and the more money that you spend, the less risky things you can try to do.
Sure.
And I think that like the future of the next 10 years is going to be a shift, I think, where technology is going to get a little bit more it's just going to improve the ability to amplify talent.
Yeah.
And you're going to have these talented people starting to realize like, hey, I can actually produce now with modern tools more minutes of entertainment directly for the public, and I don't necessarily have to give up the stability that I enjoy in VFX and in movies, and I can return to comics and kind of the way that I'm sort of doing, right? Like you can sort of like come back to it and be like, oh yeah, this is like a different way of reaching an audience and telling a broader story. And I think like Miyazaki's career in reverse, he's now the Studio Ghibli director and all these other wonderful movies, but you wind the clock back and you end up in these really cool comics that are like, if you look at the scope of the Nazca Perfect Collection, it's 4 books. It's bigger than Lord of the Rings. It's massive. And it's like this incredible story. And you're like, he tried to do it with Studio Ghibli and he made one movie that wasn't even, a tenth of the story in the comic.
Yeah.
And I think like the next 10 years are going to have audiences. I think, I think regular comics, like 2D comics and 2D arts, they don't tend to, there's still going to be a place for them, but I don't think that there's a lot of overlap between a lot of those folks who've really used 3D very much.
Yeah.
Like people like, I don't know about you, but I'm constantly talking to people who are like, they only know how to use Photoshop. And now they're looking at Blender or Keyshot or ZBrush, and they're like, ooh.
Well, it's funny
like I'm drawing, but I can spin it around.
Yeah, it's what we've noticed this last couple of months is we've put our stake in the ground with mobile sculpting with the iPad. So we've introduced a lot of, there's a couple of really key programs that you can now just sculpt on your iPad, which is something that people just don't get. So, the few hundred people that have joined us looking at that, 50% of them have never, ever used anything other than Photoshop. And that means they're going to, straight away, they're asking for content about, right, what's this Blender thing? And what's this, I believe you can sculpt in VR. And they are, that's coming into our careers from the opposite end. And I know a lot in medium, and a lot of people as well who have come to 3D modeling via Oculus Medium and sculpting in VR, and now they're going into the industry, sculpting, working back and learning Blender, and then into Maya and Cinema 4D.
The thing is that they're sort of trapped inside of a pool they're trapped inside of a bubble that hasn't popped, right? Which is that like, for most of for people like me and for people who are tech artists, we know how to push a button and take our medium sculpts and put it in front of an audience. But for most people, you work on ZBrush or you work in Medium, and now you've got like a 7 million poly mesh, and you have no way of like putting that on your kid's phone.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right. And like once you actually like go, oh, then you hit this button, and it's kind of like the Sketchfab publishing path where you're like, oh, this is actually distribution. Like this isn't just creation. This is a distribution change. And once you actually can have that creation half connect to a new distribution path, that is going to open up a bunch of doors. Because right now, you know, the Nintendo store and the Apple store and the Comixology store are between the ZBrush artist and their audience, and then between that store and the ZBrush artist is this mountain of technical ability to know how to go into Blender and retopologize and UV map and decimate and rig and light and render and everything else. And like, there's nothing that's really technically stopping someone from circumnavigating that mountain. And then when they get to the storefronts, circumnavigating those. Like once those it's like three bubbles, and once the three bubbles pop, you're going to have people who are like in the comic book space where they're basically saying, oh, I can sculpt a thing here, I can add a word balloon, I can tell a story, I can hit a button just like I do with a printer, and I can say print to audience. And then the audience goes, yay, and then they buy your poster. And like, that's really simple as a content creation supply chain feedback loop. And like, that hasn't quite happened. Like your work is still stuck in ZBrush. Your work is still stuck on that iPad, and like taking a snapshot and posting it isn't the same.
I'm only interrupting you because I'm excited, but
go ahead.
One of the things I've seen in the last 3 years, and followed it for 8 years, is Dreams on the PS4, and now PS5. And you look at the amount of detail where, we're going photoreal next year, with Unity, the next level of Unity. That I think answers some of what you're saying there, which is, it's not. I don't think the technical side of it's ever going to be easy. I mean, it will be where there will be button pressing, and you have things like Mixamo that Adobe have made to make animation, and there's always going to be that DAZ products and Poser and all of that. There always has been, and there always will be. But then your innovators dive through the middle of that, and they use that tech to make their proprietary and their exciting stuff, but they just do it faster because they've grabbed that tech. And I think Dreams, and I'll show some of that on this screen here, because the screen, because that is just mind-blowing technology.
I mean, their Dreams is bypassing the wireframe and the texture, right? Like without a single polygon, without a single texture, here's an experience.
Well, as a storyteller, if you're going to see PS5 based comics, I think, with Dreams any minute now. I think they're already.
There's people. Martin has already made a couple of those, right?
Like,
I think it's one of those things where like
Martin. I'll show some of Martin's work now as well, and it's Martin was a medium artist. He's a lot of guys. It's quite strange. We had this conversation with someone last night. A lot of these people that are doing the names that we're all popping up, the first word that you should always say is artist. Nobody comes into this and then suddenly goes back and becomes an artist. They're usually an artist. And one of the things I always bang on about is the basics. And it is the same with comics, isn't it? If you don't know your anatomy or perspective or lighting, all of those, you could pick 10 skills that you must have before you move into any of the words we've said. And that would stand you in much more of a good place than trying to learn VR first or, any of it.
Well, I think it's also that thing too, where you have there's like an editorial talent. Like there's a lot of really talented editors out there, film editors and comic book editors who are like the guys who decide like what story to tell. Like, should it be a comedy or should it be a horror? Or should it be, what tone should you be gunning for? And that sort of like that green lighting process. And a lot of those people are sort of, they're left out of the production of the pages or the production of the frames or the production of the moments because of the complexity and the vertical climb. And I think like it's always easier for the novelist to just write down on words because the words, accumulate into what you like. And there's those tools like Plotagon where like you type and it automatically generates a 3D scene based on what you type. And I never liked the output of those because there's no love in it. And I think that's part of it, is that like, I think human beings are attracted to the focus of human attention. Like you can go for a walk in the woods, and if you see that a human being has spent time really loving the way that these 5 rocks were stacked together,
Yeah.
you'll notice it. It'll stand out to you. You'll look at it and be like, a human being did something cool right there. That's awesome. Or that tree has been
It's
pruned
taken
to look
actual
beautiful.
input. Somebody has taken the time to put that together and use their own creativity. I have a little bit of a bugbear with the likes of Substance, because if you give anyone a set of pre-generated brushes and smart materials, what you ultimately get is different shaped models with the same look. And that's a lot of what ArtStation for me is. You can name the brushes now, and you can, you're seeing some amazing.
You can see. Oh, look, grit brushes right there.
As an aggregate,
and you can see the kit bash kits, right, too, right? Like you can see, like, oh, that's the same set of kit bashes. It's clip art, though, right? Like it's the same thing with clip art in comics. It's like you can make a comic with clip art. You've always been able to do that. But when you look at Oming's work, or you look at Mobius's work, or you look at Loisel's work, and you're like, oh, that just takes my breath away because of what it is. And that's where, like, okay, if they use clip art, I don't care, because, and that's the thing that I think is really inspiring, is like Oming uses like SketchUp building models in the backgrounds of his comics. And I got some other friends who, like, they'll totally, like, they have like a generic human, and then they spend a bunch of time detailing the face and the hair and the fashion, but like they have like a library of shoes, right? They have a library of pants, and that's where I'm like, ooh, they didn't spend all the time on the stuff that wasn't important. They spent the time on the stuff that I cared about, and they brought that editorial talent to bear on the thing, and they were thinking more at the fashion level and at the what should happen next storytelling experience level, which I think is like, that's the thing that I love about graphic novels in particular, is that people take the time. Like I'm giving myself time to tell my story, right? Like I did issue 1 of Nanite Fulcrum. I have the story, but I'm spending the time to tell it the way that I want, because I care about it. I want it to be just right, and I don't have to be on that treadmill of like, I've got to finish it in 20 days. But at the same time, you want to be an artist who ships. So you have like,
well, you've got, there's always financial. You've got to survive in the industry, especially if you're going to hire people, and if you're going to build it into anything, bigger than yourself, which is, what people are all struggling with at the minute is how do they do that? And, it's, for all the comic artists that are, they're sitting on, £1 million+ in the bank, there's a million that aren't. And that, if the industry is going to survive, we've got to make people have a career and have a living. And that's one of the hard, to predict where that's going. That's part of what these interviews are going to be, is where do we think it's going, and how can I inspire a 7-year-old into an industry that may or may not be there, but well, obviously it's going to be there. But what can we teach them, and how can we inspire them to get ready for that? And
I would say that, like, there are so many there's an ocean of competing ideas for your free time. Like, should I play this? There are 15 games a day that come out on, indie games, right? Like there's 400 movies that come out a year. There's X number of comics, and there's a never-ending stream of things that you can spend your free time on. And I would say that, like, to that kid, like when you sort of like draw them into this as an industry, like it's, it isn't an industry where you just move money back and forth across a border and take a profit off the top. Like, that's contributing nothing to the universe, right? Like if you want to make something and contribute to the world, make something that you love and send it out as like a light in the dark that inspires other people who love the same thing that you love. And it's okay if you only have 100 or 1,000 or 10 people who read it. You do it because someone handed you that spark of inspiration, and you got to pass the baton forward. Absolutely. And I think, like, every time one of us watches the big thing and we only watch the popular stuff, there are those millions of other people who are struggling trying to make a cool comic. And like, that's the cool thing about the comic community, is that, like, if you look at the shelf behind you, or you look at that poster behind me, it's like we spend the time to look for the weird, idiosyncratic, creator-owned weird experiments that speak to us, that are like, ooh, this is my collection of special stuff that really inspires me, and it's in my special white box that I care about. And like, that's where I think the heart of comics and the heart of pop culture and the heart of this stuff comes forward, because it's hope in a box. You know what I mean?
That's a great way to wrap up what we're talking about, because it's that puts the emotion back in it, doesn't it? And that's some of what I see now is a bit dead and a bit flat. So it's, it's great. It's great to to end this chat on that is that what we're putting in that box there is the stuff that's special to us. So we're well over time, as I'm always over time. So, you know, the magic of editing will kind of rein this back in. But there's not a word that you've said there that people won't want to hear, Bay. So it's, you know, I literally could spend all day long listening to you and talking to you. So thank you so much for the time. Yeah. And I'll make sure that I'll give you all of the links and all of the, you know, when this airs, which is going to be in November of 2020. So, you know, I'll make sure you're there and available to see it also. Thank you so much on behalf of everyone that's watching now. And let's chat again in another year.
Sounds good, man. That's awesome. Cheers, man. Thanks, everybody.